This is the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Glory to you, O Lord. One Sabbath day, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck up heads of grain. The Pharisees said to Jesus, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And Jesus said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest and ate the bread of presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priests to eat. And he gave some to his companions." Then Jesus said to them, "The Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Again, Jesus entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. They watched Jesus to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And Jesus said to the man who had a withered hand, "Come forward." Then he said to them, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. Jesus looked around at them with anger, and he was grieved at their hardness of heart. Jesus said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." Jesus stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him on how to destroy him. This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. You may be seated. At this time, I'd like to invite the younger ones among us, anyone from age 3 all the way up through, let's say, first grade-ish, to go and head back with Miss Audrey. There is a special children's church. And I would also ask if you have especially younger kids closer to that 3 age, if parents want to tag along and go with them, that would be very helpful. It's always nice to have an extra set of eyes around as well. But it's just a short little message with a video and some time together that's geared just for kids. So you can head right to the very back of the sanctuary now. You can feel free to head on back, and Miss Audrey's heading on her way out. Got a nice crowd today. That's always good. And for those of you who are late, you're going to go downstairs into the preschool area. So as they're making their way, I want to tell you a little bit of a story. Back in the early 70s, I think it was about 1973, on the campus of Princeton University, there were 2 psychology, sociology majors who wanted to do a study. And the goal that they were trying to accomplish, what they were trying to figure out, was what is it that causes one person to stop and help someone in need and other people to kind of pass on by? What is it that causes people to feel like they need to stop and to care for someone that they meet, a stranger on the street? And so the way they decided to go about doing this was to have a study there on the campus. And right there at Princeton, they also have a pretty large seminary, a place for training pastors. And at a seminary, there's typically a lot of very poor grad students who are willing to volunteer for about anything if you give them $20. So they went over there. And what they came up with was this experiment. They would have these seminary students, these future pastors, come in, and they would give them one of 2 tasks. The first task was to go into the next building over, and they were going to give a little talk, maybe a little sermon about the story of the Good Samaritan, the story where someone is hurt on the road, and someone comes and helps them and cares for them. The other task was to go into the same building next door and to give a talk on employment at the seminary, on the jobs you can do as a student. And so they had that. They had the background of all of these people. And what they didn't tell any of these seminary students, though, was that they'd also placed an actor in between these two buildings, this man with a bunch of dirty clothes that would be hunched over and kind of coughing as they walked by. And what they wanted to see was whether the background of the student, maybe if they were one particular type of Christian, one particular denomination or another, would that make them more likely to stop? Or would it be the task they were given? Would the people who were supposed to talk about the Good Samaritan be more likely to stop and help this man who was at least acting like he needed a little bit of trouble? But what they found out was that neither of those things made any difference whatsoever. In fact, the only thing that they could correlate with whether or not someone was more or less likely to help was another twist that they added to this test. When the seminary student was sent to the next building, they were either told that they were running late and they needed to hurry. They were told that they were just about on time and they should head over there kind of right away, but there wasn't any urgency. Or they were told they would have a few minutes wait and they could head over to the next building as they saw fit. As it turns out, if they were running late, only about 10% of the people would actually stop and even acknowledge the man who was there coughing. If they were about on time, it rose up, about 43% would stop. And then the people who had most of the time, a little over 60% stopped. Nothing about what sort of story or what sort of background these people had made any difference whatsoever. It was a very interesting and a kind of a startling study for many people that it was solely this sense of urgency, how much focus we had to put on this task that was ahead of us. Are we running late? Do we have time? Is there a moment to rest? In fact, even later on the same campus, there were other groups that tried to take this a little further and just see how much people pay attention to the world around them when they're running late. And so they set up a circus performer on a unicycle juggling in the middle of campus. And they watched as people went down the street past them, and they would stop all of the people at the end of the street and say, "Did you see anything strange on your trip across campus?" And about 50% of the people coming through would say, "No, I didn't see anything at all." In fact, the researchers doing this particular project actually said the hardest part was getting some of the people to actually stop. They had to flag them down, and these people were so intent on getting to their next destination, on completing their next task, the world around them essentially became invisible. I think that's telling because I think most of us probably act that way at least part of the time. I know I do. I get very focused in on the next task, on the next thing I'm going to do, and it's like the world kind of drifts away. Now, that's not always a bad thing. Sometimes that's very useful. If I'm, say, going to the hospital and have to have an operation, I really hope my surgeon is one of those people who can just laser focus in and let the world drift away. When I'm driving down an interstate and there's an 18-wheeler next to me, I hope the person up in that cab is really focused on the task that they're doing and not absorbed into their cell phone or wondering what sort of stitching is over on their passenger seat. Sometimes I wonder if that's not what they're doing, but it just all depends. Sometimes we really need to focus in, and it happens naturally with most of us. And that's, I think, why I'm at least a little bit compassionate, a little bit, feeling like I relate a little more to the Pharisees in this Bible story. In this Bible story, Jesus is kind of showing up in the temple, and the Pharisees, they're clearly the bad guys in the story. I understand that. But the Pharisees they're just trying to do their job. They have a pretty simple job. They think it's very important, and their job is to make sure that people understand and follow the rules, that people follow the laws that have been set for them, that people know what it means to be the people of God. And for the Pharisees, that means that everyone needs to know and follow the rules about what to eat and when, about what you're supposed to do and not supposed to do on this Sabbath day, this special day of the week where everyone's supposed to rest. And that's very important because, at least for these Pharisees, for the people at the time, following those rules is what kind of made them who they are. It's what separated them from the religion and culture of their neighbors. It's where they got their identity. We are the people of God, therefore we do this. And the Pharisees were the kind of arbiters, the holders of this tradition that dated back thousands of years of behaving and acting in a certain way, of following these certain rules. So it's not hard to imagine that as Jesus kind of moseys on in with his 12 friends and they're casually picking up grain, breaking all of the rules kind of at the same time, wandering into the temple, that these Pharisees, they go into kind of that blinder mode and they just see the problem and are dead set on stopping it. They're dead set on stopping it. They don't see anything else that's going on around them. And so as they focus in on Jesus and what is wrong, they miss the bigger picture. As they focus in on the problem that they see in front of them, they can't even see this person off to the side with the withered hand who is in desperate need of help. As they focus in on the problem, they can't even see that God is there with them in their temple. And that's when Jesus tells these Pharisees something incredibly important, incredibly powerful. He says that man is not made for the Sabbath is made for man, or humanity. And what he means by that is that the goal of this rest, the goal of this time away, this time off, is not just to laser focus in to follow the rules. The goal is to get people to stop, if only for a moment, and look up. To stop and look up, and maybe for the first time in that week, to see the world around them, to see the people that are around them. Because I don't think things were all that different those 2,000 years ago. People were still focused on their jobs and their tasks, and they were just as blind to the world around them as we can be. But when we have this command, this rule that every so often we must stop and we must look up, it changes us. If you look at what Jesus did, it's exactly what this rule of Sabbath is about. It's about stopping and resting and seeing those people and those faces that so often go overlooked. Jesus saw this man over in a corner with a withered hand and healed him. And Jesus does this thing again and again and again throughout the gospel story. He's constantly stopping and taking time to spend away from the crowds, this time for prayer, this time for rest and for Sabbath. And Jesus, maybe better than anyone else, when he goes someplace new, is able to see those people and those faces that get overlooked by everyone else. Jesus sees the people who are most in need, the people who are on the edges of society, the people who need that healing and that wholeness and that taste of God at work the most. And that's what Jesus is calling each of us to be a part of. We each are inheritors of those very same rules that the Pharisees were trying to enforce. We might not follow them exactly the same way, but that rule, that idea of Sabbath, of taking time off, of time to rest, is every bit as much a part of our tradition as it was back then. And the reason that we're called to take that time away isn't just to recharge our batteries or so that we'll be more efficient in our work come Monday. The reason that we're commanded to stop and to rest is so we have those moments where we look up and we see a face we would have never seen otherwise. Those moments where we look up and we see a world where God is so desperately needed that we can't help but go to work. The reason we rest is so that we can see and hear that still small voice of God calling us to something new. Sometimes only when we stop to rest and take that break do we see it and do we hear what God is calling us. And I can tell you this place is an amazing place because each and every week I see people who come into this space and who stop and rest, and then they go back out and they care for a refugee family. They go back out and they work and they fight against gun violence on our streets here in Chicago. They stop and rest and they go back out and they're active in trying to work for peace, not just here in the United States, but in places like Israel and Palestine and Myanmar and all across the world. Each and every week, each and every day, there are people who have somehow figured out how to stop and to rest and to see the world around them, to hear God's calling. And that's what each and every one of us is called to do. And I can tell you it's not easy. It's not easy to stop and rest. We all have that drive, and sometimes we just want to keep going. And when we stop, it's not always easy to know exactly what we're supposed to do, what we're supposed to see, where God is supposed to be. But every once in a while, we get a chance where we stop and we hear that voice, or we see that face that we would have ignored any other day. And we get a glimpse in the person sitting across from us, or the person on the train, or the person in our neighborhood. We get that glimpse of God at work and looking right back at us, of God at work in someone we never expected. We get a glimpse of what Jesus calls the kingdom of God. God at work in our lives, in our homes, in our communities, right here and right now. May you go out this day to rest and to look up and see what it is you might see and hear. Amen.